physical evidence that they will abduct you. Hundreds of scientific reports to do with strange abductions. This story's details get progressively more unbelievable, but there's also progressively more proof at each stage of the story. We'll also include images that are creepy, but once you know the full context of the story, that's when they become horrifying. And we'll show these at the end of the video. On Friday evening, August 20th, 1976, 4 friends in their 20s from Boston, Massachusetts were excited to go camping. Their names were Jack and Jim Weiner, twins, Chuck Rack and Charlie Foltz, and they were all artists. They were going to a gorgeous but wild part of northern Maine next to the Allagash River. This place was so out of the way that once they reached a designated point, they had to charter a pontoon airplane to take them to their next destination, which was Telos Lake, which is part of the Allagash waterway. Several days went by normally, and they were really getting into their canoeing and camping. The scenery was stunning, and this was the hobby they loved, so spirits were high, and it was a good rest for them from city life. On the evening of Thursday, August 26th, so 6 days after they had set out from Boston, they arrived at a place called Eagle Lake and set up camp. They struggled to disassemble their equipment because of how black the lighting was. Imagine the lowest amount of light possible. They were struggling in the dark to do even basic tasks, so they had to build an enormous fire. And this was also done because they realized that if they were to stray from camp, there'd be no point of reference and they wouldn't be able to get back to camp. They'd be lost in the blackness. So they did that. They made sure the fire would burn for 2 to 3 hours. They were pleased, and now they were in the mood to go trout fishing. They paddled into the waterway, some distance away from camp. They found a good fishing spot, and they settled. They're in the beautiful wilderness. They're going to catch some delicious trout. They had free time, and they just chatted and cracked jokes with each other like friends do. However, this is the last time in this story where the friends ever have a positive interaction together. After a time, Chuck Rack began to feel uneasy. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It was the sixth sense left over from our caveman days that tells you when a predator is near. Chuck just tried to focus and have a good time, but it's a feeling he couldn't shake. It was just too uncomfortable. Eventually, he decided that he had to admit it to himself. He felt something was watching them. So, he turned slowly in the direction of the sky, where his spidey sense was tingling. And remember, apart from their campfire way off in the distance, everything was pitch black. Well, Chuck's eyes were filled with a bright white light that lit up his face. Something large and silent had appeared in the sky. He immediately yelled for his friends to look. He was back at the fire, like he'd just been teleported from the middle of the lake all the way back to camp. He remembered his friends scrambling out of the canoe onto shore in fear, but Chuck himself was stunned and could do nothing except watch the sky. His paddle was still in his hands, gripped tightly, even though he didn't need to use it anymore. Minutes after the sighting, Charlie Foltz remembered paddling furiously in the center of the lake, seated in the canoe. Then, his very next memory was being back at camp, standing. He stared at the sky too. Jack and Jim Weiner's memories are a bit more compelling. Their next memories were similar to Charlie's, but they remembered some details about this unknown sky phenomenon. Details that raised more questions instead of answering them. The thing in the sky was 6 to 9 meters above the water. That's the same as a 2-story building, and 50 to 70 meters from the camp. So 60% the length of a football field. A tube of light could now be seen from the thing's belly. For 5 minutes, they stared at it, and they felt that it was staring back at them. Afterwards, they flinched a little as they saw the light cylinder, which shone downwards, abruptly changed angles to shine upwards. The object, in Jack's words, shot into the stars and was gone. It was so fast that this exit took about 1 second, and there were no acceleration or thrust noises. They were dumbfounded by this experience, and so they simply stood there, frozen. After some time, they were able to shake themselves into action, but everyone was left tired and heavy, and they walked like haunted men. And then, another completely inexplicable event happened. To their astonishment, the bonfire that was burning brightly minutes ago had been reduced to lumps of black coal. These outdoorsmen were experienced, and they personally set thick logs to burn for 2 to 3 hours, and they remembered that some of the pieces were the size of human legs, and it had been maybe 50 minutes since the entire ordeal started. When they saw this, they were already stressed out. Another creepy mystery was not what they needed at all. The men went home, their whole experience soured by this incident, and this discomfort about not really knowing what happened that night troubled them for years. They'd carry on with life, but this event was never really resolved in their minds. A few years later, Jim got into an accident. His doctors requested that he tell them about any experiences that might be unusual, because a consequence of the accident was epilepsy. Jim told them about strange old memories he could suddenly recall. When he told them, Jim saw the concerned looks his doctors gave him. They told him, okay, we can help you medically, but because this tale is so out there and strange, we can't help you at all with that. And because of this story, we're going to refer you to this man, who is a researcher, but not a medical professional. You should meet him. They referred him to Raymond E. Fowler, and this meeting would help the men come to terms with the Allagash incident, but it also kick-started a series of more stressful happenings that would ruin the men's lives. Raymond listened to Jim Wiener's story, and Raymond is a serious guy. He was wary of people who were just looking for attention or were just plain crazy, but after he heard the tale, he said, okay, I feel you're credible enough. I'd like to study you and your friends scientifically. In January 1989, so 13 years after the Allagash incident, Raymond Fowler enlisted a professional team, including a hypnotist, to work with the men. Raymond was anxious to get as much information as possible, so the friends were observed fastidiously for the next 2 years. They had a major breakthrough that solved the mystery of what happened that night. And they found out why they all had this experience of missing time between seeing the craft and arriving back at camp. The team ascertained the amnesia began when the light hit the canoe. Now, I'm going to tell you the story Jim told his doctors, as well as the extra memories that were unlocked by Raymond's team. These are the full memories of that night. Hey, please consider subscribing if you want more content more quickly. The men shielded their eyes because the source of the light was so intense. An enormous circle of coloured light hovered in silence, about 200 to 300 feet above the ground, so roughly the length of one football field. A huge, oval, glowing object. They saw that this object moved in a gyroscopic manner, like a frisbee, suspended in midair. As the friends looked, they're thinking there's no way this is some natural phenomenon. It appeared to have some kind of engine or power source, because the way it was lit suggested energy ran across its length as well as from top to bottom. It had 4 main quarters, and the light of these quarters were all moving in a rhythm. On top of this, the colours would change gradually, kind of like what you see in a lava lamp. Because of its apparent artificiality, Charlie Foltz took his flashlight and blinked in Morse code in the direction of the object. This one decision was a mistake that would haunt the men for decades. Immediately, the massive oval stopped, and then it seemed to be getting bigger. The oval was moving towards their canoe. As it did this, a cylinder of light flared from the craft, touching the water. They saw that on the surface reflection of the water, the cylinder wasn't fully lit. There was a black center, so it formed a bright ring. So the light was like an empty cylinder. It was empty for now, anyway. The friends sat in their canoe, like deer in the headlights, but when it was clear that the cylinder was moving to their exact location, they immediately went into survival mode. They had to get away from this thing, so they all paddled as hard as they could towards their campfire. So they're straining themselves, but the canoe can only move so fast. The cylinder is getting closer and closer to them, and after a certain point, it's clear to them that there's no way they can outspeed this thing. Before long, their vision is completely obscured by whiteness. The silent craft had stopped immediately without needing to brake or slow down. The beam was on them. The men felt weightless, like they were free-falling. Then they saw their canoe under them. It was empty. They were levitating. It was an eerie feeling, because they weren't moved by suction or some other man-made force. It was like gravity itself had been turned off. Like the light was technology that mankind had not invented yet. And then they were inside. For a moment, there was nothing. Until humanoid figures. The way they conducted themselves, they seemed intelligent, but they definitely were not men. They felt the primal urge to run again, the same way prey runs from a predator. Except we are the apex predators on this planet. This kind of tomfoolery was eradicated millennia ago. It stirred within the men an ancient fear that mankind had forgotten eons ago. But when they tried to struggle, they realized they could do nothing. To their horror, the humanoids used some invisible force to control their minds, and they could command them to do whatever they wanted. They were moved to an area, and the humanoids forced them to strip naked. Then they had to sit on a bench, which appeared to be like plastic, but wasn't. It was an unknown material. The area was lit with diffuse white light. Then the humanoids approached them. The figures began to touch them and moved their hands to the men's faces. But luckily, they just observed the men's eyes and mouths with a glowing pencil-like device. Afterwards, they were placed in harnesses, and the beings moved the men's limbs. The beings were very interested in the twins, particularly. After, in single file, each man was put on a surface, and various devices and machines scanned their bodies. It was here that the beings removed saliva, skin, blood, bodily waste, and semen samples from the men. In the next stage, the men, still being mind-controlled, but fully conscious, dressed themselves. They entered into another area through a round door. They felt an unusual tingle move through their bodies, and then they felt weightless again. They were in the light cylinder. The canoe appeared to have been moved by the craft from the middle of the lake to the shore. They also saw that the technology of the light held the canoe in place, and there was no rocking that you'd expect, as the light placed each of them back into the same seating order as before. The encounter was duly documented by Raymond's team, and it would have been nicer if the story ended here. The 4 Allagash men would have recovered their lost memories and just carried on with life. But life isn't fair. The next few things that happened are arguably worse than the Allagash incident. The men would not have peace. In future sessions, more things were unearthed through hypnosis. Some of the men reported that they were awakened by strange noises in their room when sleeping. They just wanted to forget the whole ordeal again. But now the paranormal activity had followed them into their own private homes. Imagine how you would feel if you couldn't even find security at home. The sinking feeling you'd have in your stomach, knowing you could never get away. When they felt brave enough to look at what was making the sounds, they saw strange, unknown creatures in their room. In other similar incidents, they felt weightless and felt their duvet slide off their bodies. Some unknown force levitated them in midair. And this is the worst one. In some incidents, they woke and were unable to move. Then they felt something ruffle around their groin area. Someone or something was probing their genitals. And then another incident which raised the bar again. I'm not joking. Interconnected events which produced physical evidence and attracted the attention of an extremely powerful organization. Jack Weiner, one of the twins, actually had another abduction happen to him. This was during the 2-year window in which the hypnosis sessions happened. When he returned, Jack had burns on his soles, and he had a scar above his ankle, which seemed to indicate that someone tried to scoop into his skin to remove something. And the scoop-shaped scar was above another scar from when Jack had surgery. That surgery was a few years before this new abduction, and was to treat this thing which baffled all of Jim's doctors. This condition was something that happened overnight. Jack's first doctor tried his best to treat this condition, but he'd never seen anything like this before, ever. So he was forced to refer Jack to more specialized doctors. They too, when they saw this thing, were at a loss and had no idea what to do. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. What it was a large growth. The lump was tested by several medical professionals, but nobody was able to determine what it was. It was then sent to the Center for Disease Control in Georgia. At least, that is what Jack was told. When Raymond Fowler checked Jack's medical records, he found out this wasn't true. The mystery lump had actually been sent to Washington, D.C., to doctors in the military. It was in Jack's medical records that an Air Force colonel also inspected the lump. When Fowler tried to chase this up, the surgeon refused to talk further on the matter, and the government refused to cooperate too. During the 2 years of observation, Raymond and his team made sure to do background checks on the men. He checked their medical history, cross-checked their stories, and tested them psychologically. During this exhaustive process, their stories always lined up with each other's. Imagine trying to be deceptive as a team scrutinizes your account. Then imagine 4 people having to do it simultaneously. It's really hard to keep a lie up between 4 people perfectly for 2 years. The men's accounts were in line with other abduction reports too. They were compared with 270 detailed reports of abductions by Dr. Thomas E. Bullard from the University of Indiana. These studies followed the same exhaustive testing methods. Alternative theories like hoaxes, fantasies, PTSD, mental illnesses, and the collective unconscious were ruled out. The men always stuck to their story, no matter what, and were tested with lie detectors. 15 hypnosis sessions took place over 14 months. What happened in the end? There is no happy ending. All of this information was compiled into a final report with 700 pages, and this was made available to other people. The report concluded that the men are credible. 3 out of the 4 men have never deviated from their stories. Their individual stories still line up with each other's years later. Chuck Rack, the man who first saw the mysterious craft, did change his story. But according to Raymond Fowler, it was because he just couldn't take the ridicule anymore. The men's reputations suffered a lot because of these experiences, and they were left traumatized. Jack himself was shunned by his community, and they were all lambasted publicly. It's worth noting the 4 men have earned next to no money from this. And there is one final thing that the 2 years of study produced. Let's see these images. Remember, all the men were artists and were able to sketch in detail what they saw. And here are those sketches. Well, thank you for watching till the end. I wrote and rewrote, then filmed and refilmed this one. I didn't want to release a merely decent product. I wanted to release the very best entertainment possible for you guys. Like if you liked it. Subscribe if you want more frequent releases. Links in the main channel page. Thank you all. Night night.